might be easier to deal with numbers than deal with humans. In fact, it is easier to deal with numbers than deal with humans. So we all have room to grow and to develop. And I want to create some grace for that, but we have to give them the opportunity to develop those skills and the resources and the training and the development.
So what are the three ingredients that make up the secret sauce of engagement?
Ooh, secret sauce of engagement. Well, what's interesting is engagement's actually an outcome. And so we have a lot of companies like, oh, we need to work on engagement, but it's actually an outcome. And it's an outcome of the employee experience. And in the employee experience, it really is, we're going to go back to where we started this conversation. It's who a company says they are and what they say they value, and how that shows up into 8 different areas of the employee experience. And not that those are the only 8, but they're the 8 that lots of studies and science have shown are the most prevalent and important to employees. And when a company walks their talk in those 8 areas, it's sort of like, oh, you did what you said you were going to do. You showed up the way you said you were going to show up. And so then I, as an employee, I have an increased engagement. And so that's the outcome that gets developed. The problem is that engagement has been largely unmoved. I can speak to the US, largely unmoved for a couple of decades. And the only time, even though we know this, we've done all these studies, we know this, we know how engagement fuels the bottom line, but still has been unmoved. And so one of the only time we saw movement engagement is in the first 4 months of the pandemic, interestingly enough. It's the only time we've seen a notable shift and increase in engagement. But it's not a surprise when you think about it. Companies were over communicating. They were very quickly adapting and adjusting and doing the best they could. I think companies were being really human about, oh, we're trying to figure this stuff out. We don't know. We went overnight. They demonstrated they cared about employees. And so all of a sudden, you have this over communication, you have this vulnerability in leadership, and you have this, we really care about you. And shocking, engagement goes up. And then we get a little fatigued. And by the September of 2020, engagement was back to pre-COVID levels. And they've largely remained there. And part of it is, again, it's not looking at, as a company, are we walking the talk in 8 areas of the employee work experience? And that's why engagement remains largely untouched. So I say it's about walking your talk in the 8 areas of the employee experience in a way that generates the reward function of the brain. So when you say the 3, people might be going, but she asked for 3, Heather, and you're talking about 8. So 1 is walking the talk. 2, in the 8 areas of the employee experience. 3, in a way that triggers the reward function of our brain. Companies that do that have higher engagement.
So how do you measure engagement? You're saying like it went up, it went down. I'm wondering, how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, largely through employee surveys and ad hoc. I mean, the annual employee survey, I would like most companies to do away with that. I would rather that they sort of do sampling drip surveys all year long. And it will better serve the employees, but it will also better serve the companies. Because I've worked in companies that do that annual survey. And so then all of a sudden it's like a month before the survey, all the managers are trying to do and say the right things because they know the survey is coming up. And then the survey happens and the employees go, no one really listens or does anything from this anyways, but I don't want to be that person. I literally had a boss once. This is awful. I had a boss who did not get as high of an employee engagement result as they wanted. And then they made all of us sit through like 8 sessions going question by question to discuss who answered something and why they answered it that way. And I said, if you want to kill your engagement, you're doing that. I mean, it was the most awful experience. But that's
investigation. It sounds like an investigation.
It really was, right? And had that employee survey been an ongoing continuous sampling group, then that leader would have seen a dramatic dip in their engagement by approaching it in that way. But that's the problem with annual employee engagement surveys.
Yeah. So before we have like lots of things that we didn't cover, but I want to talk about mindset and why you think it's so important and how you see it in general. You know, it's like a buzzword and everybody would say something different. So how do you see mindset as part of what you're doing?
You know, it's interesting. There's, I think about mindset of leadership, which I've already pointed to, the brain science of what part of the brain are people functioning in. And you pointed to this earlier that the last 2 years have been really hard.
Sure.
And there's a lot of unprocessed grief, a lot of unprocessed trauma. And I think we have a lot of people who are right on the precipice of that fear response. And so any small thing can trigger us into fight, flight, or